Hello, everyone. This is Father Paul, and I hope you're having a good day. You're listening to Copts in Conversation. And welcome to this episode of Copts in Conversation. And today I have the pleasure of talking with Peter Abdelmalak, someone you probably never heard of before, and has a very interesting story, and I'm excited to get into it. To begin with, let me just say a few things about Peter. Peter is a physician by trade. He is, in his own words, boringly average.
Yes.
And in terms of what he likes to read, what he likes to learn about, that's what we're going to get to talk about today. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Abuna. It's good to be with you.
Same here. It's great to have you. I just want to ask you to begin with, you're a physician and you studied medicine here in Canada, in Queens.
Yes.
And how was that? How was your experience as Coptic Orthodox on campus? Did you get to meet other Coptic Orthodox students? Was there a Coptic club? What was that like?
I think in university, what most people learn is there's time for things that you care about, for things that you want to do. So the thing that's said to you in your first year is, they go, look, you're used to doing well in school, you're used to learning lots of blah, 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 blah. This is going to be like drinking out of a fire hydrant. I'd done a degree in sciences, and so I was more prepared for some of the elements, let's say, than somebody who had a richer background, say, in literature. So they brought some other pieces, but when we were doing anatomy, I'd already done it. So there was a lot to learn and a lot to do, but at the same time, it's like, what are your priorities? So I actually tended to come back on the weekends. I was engaged at the time, and then my wife and I got married right at the end of my fourth year, as I was about to start residency. So I came back to see her, but also for service. We had service Friday nights, so I would leave promptly at noon on Friday and make it back to Guelph, where my family is, and where I would come back to. And there'd be service in the evening, and then I'd be around for church. Kingston is a lovely community, but it's small. It's about the size of Guelph, but a lot of people transition to and from Kingston. You go there because it's good to career climb. Queens is a great university. You could career climb a little bit there for a while or whatever, but you're usually few people, although there were some, are stationed there to live there and to have their family there, and their next generation will grow up in Kingston, that kind of thing. So the church community was small, but they were doing as well as they could, and they had a rented property, and priests would come and visit and serve. And Abuna Bechomios was from the monastery. He came and served with us for a while. I think
Kingston, wow.
Yeah. It was hoped that he would stay and be the permanent priest, in fact. And then one day he sort of let us know there was a monastery thing happening, and he was integral to it. So it was cool being at Queens. I didn't have the same sort of community that people in this area would, and I think that is sorely missed, and people in Kingston have a difficult time of it. I had no other Copts in my year. The year below me had two, and an Armenian guy with an Egyptian dad, and so the year below me had three Copts, essentially, if you will. And then I had a few very devout Catholic people who I was close with as well, and that kind of thing. But it was isolated, for sure. Forgive my boldness in this, but also some of the Copts who went to Queens were trying to get away from their scene, or they just didn't want to deal with other Coptic people or whatever. And so doing a Coptic club, which we did eventually have, thanks to actually some of the guys underneath me and the year below me, it was an interesting thing. It was beautiful, though, because you saw people who came to Kingston to get away from, being around so many Copts, if they were in Mississauga, Brampton, Guelph, GTA area, that kind of stuff, who sort of started to come back because there were only 5 or 6 people and they could actually get close to all of them. Or somebody like Abuna Bechomios, God bless him, he would check up on everybody because obviously he could, and he has a great heart, and you know him, and I know him, and he's amazing. And so it was kind of cool. We did have a Coptic club eventually, for the disenfranchised probably, but Thank God it did take off, and I believe it's still going. I actually haven't checked up on it in a while, but
and they have a permanent priest now.
They do.
The church is growing, thank God, and
and the people there, the servants who are dedicated there, that are living in Kingston, that will continue to, they're all wonderful. They're beautiful people. They do as best as they can to make sure everybody feels like they're at home. So there's a couple, for example, that would routinely host the students, and they didn't have to. They just said, "You're coming to my house this coming weekend, and we're gonna have food." Campus events when we'd have priests come and things like that, whether from the Eastern Diocese or from here, and then go, don't worry, Tanjiji is gonna do all the cooking and just gonna have tons of food for your event. So awesome. They were awesome.
That's good to hear. And obviously, experience on campus differs from one person to the next. But just a lot of stuff that happens on campus, it ends up being the place where you really experience the work of God. You have all these plans, you're going there for your own purposes, and you have your own, schemes, and you're gonna, reinvent yourself and all that, only to go there and really discover and encounter Christ. And he does stuff, he changes you, he shows you who you really are. What you began in as a service here in Mississauga, it was something very interesting, and when I heard of it, this wasn't something that was common, something that I hear about happening in many churches. So it piqued my interest, and I really wanted to know more about it, and I heard really good things about it, and I started to ask about who's leading this meeting, who's kind of in charge of this meeting, who's behind this meeting. And the reason being, I wanted to know, this meeting must have someone who has spent a lot of years, studying theology and studying, church history and patristics, and really well versed in patristics, and must have, gone to seminaries and degrees and all sorts of things. And then, to my surprise, that wasn't the case.
It was just boringly average Peter.
It was boringly average Peter. And again, that keeps coming, that theme of boringly average keeps coming through, and it's so important and it's so key. And I want to know, the meeting that we're going to be talking about is a meeting where church fathers are discussed, are key, are primary, and it surrounds their writings and their thought and their teachings and their method and all of that. And all of this, how did it come about from someone who's boringly average? Before we get into that, about you personally, how did you get the church fathers, and maybe how did you start reading them? How did you start getting exposed to them?
So I guess for those listening, patristics is just the writings or readings of the church fathers, and so coming from the word pater, for father, and I sort of grew up not entirely within the church. I was baptized and I went to church and I came to liturgies sometimes, but it wasn't really until I was a young man, say 15 or 16. One, I liked having debates, and that was a bad thing. The debate the atheist in your class thing was very popular in my generation. I'm sure you know that scheme all too well, Abuna. And I'm a brash, bold, whatever kid at the age, and I want to win these arguments. And then we had a couple of servants where I was growing up at the time, who would ask these difficult questions about why it is we think we should read the Bible, what Jesus' death really means, why we celebrate multiple feast days, and some of these just hilariously basic questions. You think, it's the Bible, man. What are you talking about? Yeah. Or Jesus, he died. This is a fact. This is the faith. What do you mean? Why are you asking me what that means? And one servant in particular was very good at then being then picking apart all our answers, doing that sort of Socratic method where you'd suggest something and he'd go, "That's stupid, here's why." Or he'd say, "If I was an atheist, that's baloney," or whatever. And so between that and starting to mature a little bit, I think I started to want to learn more and ask questions and to figure out, what does this mean? What's the point of all of this? I didn't know any better at the time, other than to like go to chapters or Indigo or whatever it's called now, you know what I mean? And to pick up the random books, Unlocking the Bible, The Case for Christ, and so on. So I read a lot of what I later found out were Protestant authors, and I had some family who was Protestant and all that stuff, and that wasn't bad, it wasn't good, it was just what it was. But it's all I had to hand, you know. There were some other books of His Holiness Potion, which I read. I struggled with some of the translations, you know, and things like that. But I was also looking
some of the earlier translations were just not great.
Right, and so
the ones are much better.
Are they?
Yeah.
Yes, there are a few, like Life of Repentance and Purity. That one's
they
much
retranslated
better.
Recently,
so, but I was looking for something more. You know, I would read things like Case for Christ, and I'd go, okay, I can prove to you that the tomb was empty. You know, and here's these historical facts why. But it struck me that nothing of what I was reading was something that I would go to die for. Like I had learned, even in passing, the early Christians would, you know, from saint stories, from saint movies, from my grandmother, you know, from church, whatever, you would hear these stories of the martyrs and defending their faith. And for some reason, and I don't really know why, but God works in the ways that He does. And one day I'm sort of thinking, like, I wouldn't really go to die for anything that I read. The fact that, you know, the secret Gospel of Mark was a forgery by a guy trying to make it big in the archaeology industry didn't transform me. It was a fact, and facts aren't bad. They're just facts. But I didn't find anything in them that was life-giving or transformative or real in that sense, even though they were real facts. And so I really just wanted to figure out why I was doing what I was doing, why it was, you know, I was 16 or 17 having debates with atheists in my class, but nothing of what I read changed anything about my life. And so it was then that through happenstance, it's not happenstance, by God's grace, I happened upon actually Father Peter Farrington's work, who I'm sure Otzak is aware of. And it really struck me. He was talking about the church fathers, but in a way that was now personal, in a way that was now like, here is what Ignatius of Antioch said, here's what Severus of Antioch, who he loves, talked about, and so on. And I go, this is fascinating. I mean, this stuff is really cool. And then I learned that there was this Saint Athanasius guy who they called apostolic in the church, and I was like, that guy sounds really important. And of course, the church here began with his chapel, which is still here with us, thank God. And there's a center now being built, I believe. So I was like, this guy sounds important. I should really read the guy that they call apostolic. That seems like a pretty big title. And so I read on the Incarnation. I know you love the Book of Muna. And I was, so I didn't understand most of it, I think, but I didn't know that at the time. You know, I read the book and I was like, this guy is fascinating. He's asking all these difficult questions. He's saying, why does Jesus become flesh? Why would the Logos do this? Okay, so he does it for this reason. Here's also how he had to manifest. How can you prove the resurrection? And he'd give all these answers that didn't make sense to me. And I think by God's grace at the time, I was like, there's clearly something wrong with me, why this doesn't make sense to me. So for example, in that famous example that he gives, he'll go, look, the way that we know that the resurrection is true is that Christians go to their death. And that really spoke to me at the time because of my struggle. And I was like, cool, that's not what I expected. What do you mean we know the resurrection's true because people are willing to die? And that took time and God's work to really get into my heart. But once I had discovered him, I was like, yo, these church father guys, like there's something here. There's a richness, there's a depth, there's a reality that I really want to tap into. And so then the next thing that I happened upon, I believe also still through Father Peter Farrington, but once you sort of get into the world, you're in a sea of it, once you realize, right? I figured out that there were apostolic fathers, which are just fathers who are disciples of the disciples themselves, of Jesus. So when I found that out, I was like, this is cool. This is nothing short of miraculous. The way of writings from guys who sat with the apostles. And so then I found that John the Beloved, of course, St. John, because he lived the longest, he had the most disciples. And so I learned about St. Ignatius of Antioch and St. Polycarp of Smyrna, and I was like, I can't believe we have writings from guys who died within a lifetime or two of the Lord himself, and who learned from the guy who we consider the theologian, the first one properly called theologian, John the Gospel writer. And so I was like, this is mind-blowing. So I read the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, and in it I saw things like reference to bishops, deacons, priests, and he'd say things like, without these there's no church. I'd read him talk about the Eucharist, which I had struggled with. Is it symbolic, as some Western Christians might say? Is it literal? Is it whatever? This kind of stuff. And he goes, look, those who deny this incur death in the midst of their disputes because they deny this which gives life. And in another letter, he calls it the medicine of immortality. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like I need to be more into church. I need to learn more both about my own faith through the writings of the church fathers, but also by really actually getting into church for real this time, because clearly this is the place that has housed the faith of somebody like Ignatius, who learned from St. John. And then the icing on the cake at the end of that really was when I learned that Polycarp then had a disciple named St. Irenaeus of Lyon, who died in about 202. When I read his work against heresies, of which the first volume has a bunch of gems, and then the rest of volume 1 and volume 2 are mind-numbing, because he's summarizing the arguments of Gnostics at the time, which we can get into later. But then books 3, 4, and 5 of this like 300-page text that is with us from 1800 years ago is an exposition of the faith. And I went, where has this treasure been? I can't believe that people have said, church fathers or things like that, people have mentioned these things before, but nobody ever told me this treasure existed. Right. And from there, from about when I was 16 or 17, I was like, these are riches, man. And so I just kept reading as much as I could, really, because I fell in love with the church fathers.
That's amazing. And just curious, any of the atheists you debated with and, showing them, the facts of the case for Christ, case for the resurrection, where did these facts lead them?
As Otzak knows, like nowhere. Often people, and I think this is a really interesting thing about Orthodox, quote unquote, apologetics, if you will, because it's such an overused term today. I think
it is.
Apologia just being the word for defense. Orthodox apologetics has never looked the way that we do it in the West necessarily, right? Where St. Justin the Martyr writes an apologia, and he's not going, and St. Justin the Martyr, sorry for those listening, is a 2nd century church father. He's not going, here's a fact about science, here's a physical law that proves God, here's some sort of constant that must be God-driven. He goes, this is the life of Christians, this is what it looks like. You have to taste it if you want to know what it actually is. Yep. And so in Orthodoxy, we've always had this teaching from the very first centuries of like, here we can talk about why this makes sense and it's reasonable and it's philosophically coherent and all this good stuff, but you're entering into a relationship, a marriage union with the Divine Trinity, not an intellectual debate with a smart guy. And if you walk into faith hoping to find somebody smarter, you may be disappointed. You may not be. We have tons of smart, amazing people, but you're not going to get what you're actually looking for, which, if you're looking for real faith, is in union with the living God, and that has to be experienced and lived. Right. And it was only years later, after reading the church fathers, that I go, all those arguments I had were so wrong-headed. Right. And I would get angry and impassioned and this kind of thing. And the other guy would just sort of go, you people and your faith is stupid. And now I realize why that was the case, because I was giving him something that was really not a life, just a set of facts, and nobody can fall in love with a set of facts.
It's like dead knowledge, giving the living experience of encountering Christ. And I think that's part of the issue, is that people think that if only I have the right answer or the right combination of arguments presented in the right way, just people will be convinced. And despite, the best efforts of, the smartest people who take that approach, it doesn't work. This is not how people are converted. This is not how people come to the faith. This may be the reason people and their curiosity might be piqued, but if it stays there, if it stays in that sphere, it's it's stillborn. It doesn't ever get to produce life. They say the the best way to make an atheist mad is to give him a good answer. Because at the end of the day, like, you give him a good answer and, you know, it makes perfect sense, coherent, logic, everything. And it just makes him mad because, you know, now he's going to go back to the drawing table and try to get something to throw back at you. And then, you know, the cycle continues. Then maybe you go back to the drawing table and figure something out. So I really love how you got into the church fathers because, you know, it doesn't seem to fit the popular idea of, you know, people who are into the richness of the tradition of the Orthodox Church, who are, you know, the special group of people. Here's just some 16-year-old kid who is, you know, talking about his faith and arguing with people and starting to read, and bit by bit he's led into this deeper mystery, this deeper encounter with the church, with Christ, with tradition. And that's beautiful and that's amazing. And that's really going to be the theme for this conversation, is that boringly average is actually quite amazing, because all of this is accessible to all of us. It's not something that's reserved for the elite, for some sort of, you know, elite category of believers who are, you know, only if you're inclined philosophically and you enjoy this kind of, you know, philosophical debates, then this is going to make sense to you. This is, you know, this is for the boring. If you find yourself, you know, saying, I'm just the average, you know, church goer, this is it. This is it for you. It's perfect. How has your experience been when speaking with others about church fathers?
So, I don't know if this needs to be said, but as your reverence was talking about, we have this meeting where we read the church fathers together, with the intent being like, a lot of people struggle with the church fathers, right? Or they struggle even with the concept, as you said. That's for somebody with a doctorate degree or is a member of clergy or whatever. And by God's grace, we were able to start this meeting where we were like, okay, let's read the church fathers together. Not necessarily there at the time of the meeting, but read the text alone during the week. And we would pick up, you know, works that had divided homilies and things like that. And then people would come. And the goal was to be like, let's go through the text together. What struggles did you have? What questions did you have? What didn't make sense? Whatever. And then there was the opportunity to add context, you know, where people would say, I have no idea what he's referencing here. And it'd be because they had never heard of Apollinarianism, which is, you know, lesser known, but was important at a certain part of the church's life towards the end of the 4th century, right? And so we would fill in that context together, so then people could go back and reflect on the text and go, oh, that's what that really means. One of the interesting things, so I guess before that even maybe, one of the guiding quotes that has always sort of been in my mind when I think about how to talk to other people about the church fathers is actually something from a modern Yaroslav Pelikan, who I know it's like knows the name. He was a professor of church history at Yale, right, forever. And towards the end of his life, he converts and becomes Orthodox. And so I've always found him really interesting, because I guess it takes a lot of gusto, I think, to be teaching other people about the history of the church for 50 years and then to go, but you know what, here's actually where home is. In his 1962 Jefferson lectures, before he even became Orthodox, he has this dictum that I think is really fitting. He says, look, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And so if you're thinking about tradition as the living faith of the dead, you know, what we're talking about with the church fathers is how do we inhabit and live in the faith that they're passing us down, that's witnessed by their lives, by their writings, by the stories about them, by the hymns of the church. How do all of these things fit together so that we have the image of one passing a baton, not one saying, here's a set of, you know, texts, read them, enjoy, as though, you know, you're reading case law as a lawyer or something, you know, to know the precedents or something like that. Sorry for lawyers. But, and I think when I first encountered other people reading the church fathers or being curious or whatever, when the group started, there were a bunch of very keen people who came, so they kind of knew what to expect. And then a bunch of people who sort of heard about it from somebody else started to come, and they came in, I think, not knowingly and not nefariously, of course, but sort of believing that we were going to talk about that traditionalism thing, which is the dead faith of the living.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. A guy named Cyril of Alexandria who died in 444 said so. Okay, that's nice. Awesome. Thanks. Great. Why would any average person care about that if they weren't a specialist or a member of clergy or whatever? And so I think what I was so intrigued about was when we were able to make connections, when people could go, wow, this Basil the Great guy sounds like a great guy. And I'd be like, yeah, he started the world's first hospital and the world's first orphanage. And people would be like, no way. That's like that's an important part of Western society. But like, yeah, you have the church to thank for that, because that's not an organic part of the ancient Roman society. Ancient Roman societies don't care for people like that. They don't care for those who are not their own. Right. To illustrate this point, I'll quote to people a letter from Julian the Apostate, who was one of the emperors that tried to bring the empire back to paganism right? in the later 4th century, who happened to be a school buddy of Basil the Great and Gregory the Theologian. And at one point, one of his letters to his priests, he goes, look, the Christians clearly are outdoing us because they're taking care of not just their own, and not just the Jews, but our people too. And we don't even do a good job taking care of our own. So let's start to try to imitate them, which is so countercultural to paganism in the ancient world. And so when I share things like this with people, they go, no way. So these people actually like change things about the world. I go, yeah, the world you live in is shaped by the church fathers and by the life of the church and how Christianity pervaded everything that we know and understand and think. And so we started to come to that. People go, maybe this stuff is really important. And then you had the other group, and this was really beautiful. There was a whole other group of people that were very, very devout, went to Tasbih multiple times a week, still do, and have probably memorized all the liturgies we have and so on. And it was like lights would turn on in their mind when we'd read something. They go, is that like the first host when we say this? I go, exactly. And they go, no way, it all connects. Yeah. And watching those things was really phenomenal. Because you get people all of a sudden realize, okay, this stuff matters. This stuff is actually real. It's not just dead guys talking. And I think those were the things that really got people past the hurdle, because there were a lot of people who were like, I'm just not smart enough for this, man. Right. There's still people who tell me, Peter, I'm just not smart enough, for you. And I look at them and I sort of laugh because I'm boringly average, as we've said. So, and I'm like, I'm not that smart. I first read St. Athanasius on the Incarnation, and then when I reread it a year later, I was like, I didn't understand most of this text. It turns out I'm an idiot, and then when I reread it again, and every time I reread it still, I'm like, oh, it turns out I missed this whole section, mentally. I just didn't even understand something was happening. And I think that's the beauty of it, is the more and more we come to faith, the more and more we come to our devotion to Christ, the more we come to liturgy, partake of the Eucharist, we get closer with our spiritual fathers who guide us in the fight against sin and for virtue, the more we get into the church fathers and go, oh, wow, look at the depth of this. And so I think that sort of real lived experience, that real like this stuff matters and actually changes us, has been what has helped some people at least go, okay, you know what, I do like this stuff and I can read that and maybe I can learn something from it, even though I don't have an advanced degree or I'm not a philosophical person or whatever.
And the thing is, like, there are obstacles, there are challenges, like you said, there are hurdles to overcome. But the whole process is so worth it that it makes these hurdles, a small price to pay. And that's the thing that people don't usually realize, that these hurdles, in comparison with hurdles that they've already gotten over in whichever career they're in, like if they're in medicine, if they're in engineering, no matter what career they're in, they've already spent enough time reading and analyzing and learning, and it takes a fraction of that effort to get into the world of the fathers, to begin to have a conversation with them, right? To read their stuff, and with the understanding, of course, that there will be technical jargon that's going to need explaining. There will be guidance that we need to seek, kind of someone holding your hand, taking you step by step. But it's very doable for, like we started saying, for the average person, right? This is not something for someone whose IQ is, in the top 100, like 99th percentile. No, this is for everyone, right? And as you mentioned, there are different people coming from different places in their lives, and different things appealing to them or attracting them, and they begin to make these connections. But in order for these connections to be made, what kind of requirements or prerequisites? I mean, do I need to know philosophy? Do I need to know history? Like, in order for me to begin to make connections and to begin to see like what these fathers are saying is relevant, and not just relevant to what the church is saying, it's relevant to life today, relevant to my faith today. What kind of prerequisites are required to kind of begin to engage with the fathers?
I think in terms of like necessity, your spiritual life has to be a focus, because it's very easy to read the church fathers and to feel like I'm justified, or I'm smart, or I'm better than whatever, because I can now tell you that Severus of Antioch wrote these letters, and that stuff is cool and really important. But if it doesn't come back to the living relationship that I have with Christ, then these are just facts. The same way those facts that I first learned about were nothing to me. So I think that, to be very honest with you, Abuna, and you can correct me if you disagree, I think that's the only real requirement, as like you must do this. In terms of what would be helpful, I think the beauty about reading the church fathers is that there's something there for everybody. So my friends who like art, there's stuff there, writings about what would be called iconoclasm in the 8th century, and disagreements about why we use or don't use icons or things like that. There's writings about that. There's a book, for example, by a scholar on the concept of beauty in the writings of St. Gregory of Nyssa. If you're fascinated by the philosophy of beauty and these ethereal out there ideas that are really beautiful when you get into them, there's a book for you. However, if you're the person that sort of goes, I don't really know, I just want to know how to repent, like I need to know why I keep struggling in my life, there's books for you, right? And when I got into the church fathers, I was reading the old Nicene, post-Nicene Fathers collection, which I thought was a gold mine. You can access if you type in ccel.org into your browser, click enter, and then there's a tab for church fathers. You now have 38 volumes of the church fathers at your fingertips, right? And I was like, this is amazing. But they're from the late 1800s. Right. And so I got very used to that kind of writing, to be honest. I kind of love it now, because the long-winded sentences with multiple subclauses now kind of attracts me. But for a lot of people, it's difficult. I was drowned in that. And so I sort of swam, whether I liked it or not. But now there's easy to read, right? Church Fathers translations. There's early Christian writings, which is a series of translations. There's popular patristic series, which a lot of people know about from St. Vlad's. That's another series. There's ancient Christian commentary, which a lot of people have heard about, and is great if you want little selections about various verses and thoughts and things like that, maybe even places to go further. But I would suggest that whatever your interest is, there's something in the church fathers for you. Ask somebody who may know where to start you off if you want. The big thing that I tell people, though, I'm like, learn to become a patient reader, because especially if you're reading the older translations where there's a sentence with 3 different subclauses, it takes 5 lines to get to the point. You have to read something and not go, what did I get from the sentence? What's the fact? What do I need to know? What are the 5 bullet points that I'm going to regurgitate in Maharagan or Sunday school? Yeah. You need to be like, okay, I'm going to bend the knee of my intellect, if you will, and bow to this text in terms of my intellect and say, what is it trying to teach me? If I don't understand, maybe there's a problem with me. And what I find is when people do that and allow the text to begin to speak to them and sort of go, how he said that really doesn't fit how I think, then they can allow it to challenge their presuppositions. And that's the hardest thing, right, as a reader, is to go, oh, how he's using this word is not in any way what I mean. I can illustrate if you think it'd be good.
Absolutely.
So something I cite commonly, and all my friends have heard this a million times, is I tell people, like, look, when the Lord says to a bunch of people that are following him, he said, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. a lot of us take that as, okay, proof of the Eucharist, cool, point. That's the end of the sentence. And of course, our Western Christian friends in the Protestant church go, no, that's figurative and so on. But if you really want to get into what's being said, what you really have to do is go back to like Leviticus and Numbers, books that many of us never read, and realize that
just
blood.
gloss over and say like, oh, especially the book of Numbers, just lists, bunch of lists.
And then you go back to those texts and you're like, cool, blood in those texts is the life of an animal. Because, and of course, in Moses writes, as we have in the church, right? He's the author of the first 5 books. He says, you shall not eat the flesh of an animal with its blood, for all the life of all flesh is in its blood. I think about that as a phenomenon. If you're watching it as a first century Jew, when you kill an animal, when you slit its throat to sacrifice or to eat or whatever, you watch it writhe about a little bit. And then when it loses enough blood, it sort of gets down and stops moving very much. And then when it loses even more blood, it dies. And so what you see with your own eyes, what your experience actually tells you is blood is a life force or a life thing. It communicates life. And there's a bunch of other biblical images that can be added to that. But when you take that to John 6 and you're like, oh, so when the Lord says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you, he's citing an example they understand.
Right.
But all we read as 21st century moderns is either cannibalism or some really weird magical ritual, right? And so that's a biblical example of something that we have to get back to with the church fathers, where when they say something, they may not mean it the way we mean it. They may not use the phrase, the idea, the context in the exact same way that we do. But as modern sort of children of the Enlightenment, we tend to think that the way we view the world is just a fact. It's just a given. So I tell people all the time, I go, look, to give a quote-unquote TLDR to this long tangent, I go, look, just don't presume you know what the text is talking about right away when you read it. Bend any of your intellect and say, okay, I'm going to learn from this. It knows something I don't, or this church father knows something I don't, and I'm just going to be patient and wait for the point to be made. I'm not going to read a sentence or 2 or 3 and say, I don't get it, this doesn't make sense, this is stupid, and close the book. I'm going to go, okay, I don't really understand what's happening, but I'm going to keep reading. And that I actually lived through, because I didn't, and that this isn't a good thing, but I didn't really have anybody at the time when I started to read the church fathers to tell me, what does this mean, or what am I reading about, or what's this random controversy that just got brought up. I just kind of got thrown in the deep end. And what I realized was I'm a lot dumber than I think I am, you know? And that was good, because what it meant is I could learn to be patient and go, okay, I have no idea what happened for 20 pages. But if I just keep going and then I read more writings of this particular church father, I will get into his mind. Phronema is the word we use for this in the church, right? I will get into his mindset and start to understand how he is saying these things and what the categories mean to him, not to me. And I think that's the really big thing with us as modern readers, because we're impatient, right? There's a Spark Notes for everything. There's a Wikipedia article for everything. The last time any of us went and got, an Encyclopedia Britannica to get background about something we didn't know was never.
Basically.
My experience in university was I was the sort of second, maybe third generation of people who never picked up a physical journal, right? To go, oh, you have a research paper to write. Go write it. And we go, okay, cool. Google facts about
All
blank
digital.
and blank, right? And then they introduce the searches with the fancy advanced searches, and you go blank and blank together. You get 1,000 electronic articles. You don't have to read them. If you read the abstract, you pretended like you were an expert. You quoted it. You had a bibliography as long as your whole body, and you sounded like a genius.
Yeah.
And I think that has debilitated us as readers in general, but especially with people who lived at a time and thought in a way completely different to us. Because we take our suppositions and go, I know what he's saying about this, but it turns out we're completely wrong most of the time.
Right. And that's very important to note, that you have to be a patient reader. You can't just assume that just because they're using similar words, let's say, that you would use in a conversation, in a sentence, that they mean what you would mean if you were saying these words. And being a patient reader means that you're getting into not only their mind, but their world. They had an educational system that's different than our educational system. So for us to just presume that they break things down and present their understanding in ways that we would do it's almost leading us in the wrong conclusions, right? We need to be patient and get into their world, and not just get into the world, but understand like where they're coming from, how they view the world. We don't look back to the fathers, but we look with the fathers to the future. Meaning that we look with them in their mindset, we get into their minds, and we look with them at how they see the world, how they see themselves, how they see God, how they see all of these things interact with one another. And with this, we begin to understand what it means to have, a patristic faith, a tradition of the church that is alive. It's not just, a bunch of maxims or sayings or quotes that we can just pick and choose and throw at, our enemies or people we're having a debate with, and then, call it a day. It's something that's living, right? So in order for it to be truly living, you need that time, you need that patience, right? The church fathers are for everyone, and they're not just a matter of, a luxury that it's something that will be nice to get into if I have time. And all that is required, as you said, and I completely agree, is that your spiritual life is in focus. That's my goal, that's my aim. And the fathers had the same goal and had the same aim, that pursuit of perfection, that journey towards virtue. And it's very important for us to know that it's not just something that complicates an otherwise simple faith, beautiful faith. This is the simplicity of the faith. This is the beauty of the faith. For the fathers, it wasn't about just introducing philosophical categories and big words and big technical terms into an otherwise, simple faith, and saying things that are needless. These are all things that make the faith as, as accessible and as experiential as possible. It's not just, an additional layer that we have to peel off in order to get to the real faith. This is the real faith. And everything we see in church, everything we do, everything we experience in church, it has their hands on it. Has, they touched everything. They spoke everything. They experienced everything. When we look back at the writings of the fathers, and we see, for example, what they thought a church is, we only find, the four, the one holy, Catholic, and apostolic, and we see like they describe their experience, and it is through reading their writings is that we get to live their experience and being in conversation with them and in pray with them as they're praying. I wanted to ask you another important question, and this one takes us beyond, the meeting, which I hope is, by now everybody realizes that this is something quite doable, and at the same time quite necessary to have. And it's something I hope that every church incorporate, like if not having a specific meeting discussing the church fathers, but at least incorporate it into some sort of Bible study or spiritual meeting, because this is so important. They're not just kind of footnotes that you use to kind of support something you're trying to say. You go and Control F and look for something they try. It's almost like without the fathers, what you end up with is this shallow, flattened presentation of the faith that really leads you nowhere other than a reflection of your own ego, a reflection of yourself, right?
Yeah.
You need the fathers in order to be able to see Christ.
Yes. And the analogy that Saint Irenaeus uses, as opposed to Pelican, he says the faith is like a symphony, and it's got multiple parts and multiple instruments and vocals and so on. He goes, what your role is as a Christian is to enter into the symphony. You're going to be a part that doesn't exist anywhere else, right? That God has made uniquely in your own way to participate. If you're out of tune with the symphony, though, you're not going to be part of it. And if you never jump in and actually do your part, you're also never part of it. So that kind of kills this modern, I'd call a heresy, maybe a blasphemy of individualism. but it also doesn't eliminate the person created in the image and likeness of God who's meant to be part of this choir. And so if you can enter into the symphony in your own way, that's because you've lived the life, or you are currently trying to live the life that has been passed down through the writings and faith of the church fathers and mothers, so that you can actually now play your part, you know, to stand in the same place on the shoulders of giants, if you will, and now to preach and live the same faith, which is why we continue to celebrate the martyrs and the saints and this kind of thing.
Right. And when we go and look at their writings, it's almost like we have these specific questions and challenges that we're facing today, and we're looking to them as if, you know, it's some sort of list of Q&A, and we just want the answer to the question so we can just plug it in. But it's not an answer that we get, but instead of we get a thought. So when we're facing challenges like today, one of the biggest challenges that we face is that everything has to be on the individual level. Everything has to be, you know, this individual pursuit of whatever it is you deem to be meaningful or significant. The sense of community, although really felt and seen to be important, is pushed aside for, you know, to give space to, you know, the individual doing their own thing. You know, you're an autonomous center of consciousness, doing your own thing, pulling, you know, yourself up by your own bootstraps, and, you know, there's no one else and nothing else, and you're isolated into your own little world. And when we look at the fathers and say, like, okay, fathers, tell me, is it okay to do things on my own? Can I be an individual, or do I have to be part of a community? And sometimes we don't find direct answers, but what we do find is the thought behind the answer, the understanding behind it. Because the questions, like nothing new under the sun. Yeah. The questions that keep coming up over and over and throughout the centuries are, you know, little small modifications of heresies that have been challenged and faced by the church, and the fathers shed light on all of these things. And like, for example, when we see a lot of challenges or questions today about bioethics, and questions of bioethics, you know, with modern medicine produce very unique challenges and situations that in the ancient world, these particular situations were unthought of simply because the technology didn't make these situations possible. Yeah. But it's not like that makes the church fathers useless, for lack of a better word, in answering or approaching these questions, because it's the thought that they give us, the way of thinking, the way of approach is what they give us in order to be able to kind of even begin to formulate an answer. What is human life? Where does life begin? Is life important? Is life significant? Is life, you know, and questions about beginning of life, you know, issues, end of life issues, pain and suffering. And for the most part, pain and suffering today is frowned upon. Like, it's the measure of a society is how little pain and suffering you have, and the less the better. And then we see a different vision with the fathers. We see like pain and suffering is just this thing that's central in almost all of the writings. Like, it's not something that you can kind of avoid and see maybe if they found a trick or two to kind of get around pain and suffering and the necessity and the place for it in our lives. But you look at the questions or the challenges that we face today, and it's all like, you know, if my life is too painful to bear, you know, is it okay if I put an end to it, put a limit to it? Is it okay if I, you know, avoid pain and suffering by any means? The reason I focus so much on pain and suffering is because it's one of those questions that kind of touches a lot of people, and a lot of people when they're faced with these questions, they want to know, like, what kind of opinions out there. And when you Google stuff like this, like, you get all sorts of answers coming from all over the map, right? And you see the vision that the fathers present, the tradition of the church presents, and you see that this is something that's they saw it in a completely different light. It's not something to be avoided. It's part and parcel of that spiritual journey. So my question is, in your experience with reading the fathers, with discussing the fathers, with with having this meeting, in terms of mindset or methodology, how has that kind of manifested itself in the conversations? Are people looking for kind of distilling what the fathers are saying into methodology, or basically looking for direct answers that we can plug in? Kind of the trend today, just we want the quick 30-second hot take on this from this church father on this particular issue, and just call it a day.
So I think people's inclination is to the latter, right? Is to go, okay, cool. Since there is a wealth or a bank of information or whatever you want to call the writings of the fathers, maybe we'll have answers to questions. And sort of like, I think unfortunately sometimes we leave Sunday school thinking like you just have to have the right answers to the right set of questions, then you're an okay Christian. What I would consider a sort of pseudo-Gnostic form of faith today, and we can talk about what that means later. But I think in having the meeting, what people have really come to is to understand that changing your mindset or your framework allows you not just to plug in answers to questions you think you had, but to really find out how to change the way you view the world. And then suddenly you start to see the world as Christ has made it, as opposed to how we've been styled to by sin or by various ideologies or whatever. It's hard to look at God crucified in the flesh on a cross, on the most humiliating, despicable way possible. The Romans and the Eastern Persians and so on disagreed about who invented crucifixion because of how brutal it was, right? They would argue like, no, it was the other guy.
Yeah, it wasn't us, it was them.
It's hard to look at God crucified in the flesh and to be like, suffering must be avoided. When he then rises from the dead and goes, you must pick up your cross and follow me. And he doesn't just say, oh, some people have a cross, some people have it bad. Some people like Peter the Apostle are going to be crucified upside down. He says, all of us have this role. And so coming to the church fathers, you have this opportunity to go, okay, what's different in my thinking that doesn't allow me to access this wealth of knowledge and to learn about this faith in a real, tangible way? To cite a couple of examples, because stories usually help to illustrate. When you think about things where the church fathers have answered questions for us, but they're not sort of the way we would formulate it. You have, for example, when I present this, I'll tell people like, you've all, whether in Sunday school or to somebody else, taught this heresy, but you don't know it, is a guy like Marcion of Sinope from the 2nd century. So Marcion of Sinope was a shipbuilder and had some money and that kind of thing, and he donated to the church, I believe is the Church of Rome. And he wanted to be incorporated and also validated, because what Marcion thought was the God of the Old Testament sounds like a very brutal God, and Jesus is so lovely and dainty and all that stuff, sort of like we have today, right? Because Jesus would have never said anything mean to anybody, and you're like, yeah, watch what he says to the Pharisees next chapter, And Marcion goes, well, the God of the Old Testament, and this, to be clear for anybody listening, is heresy and was condemned, right? Yeah. The God of the Old Testament is an evil God, what he called the demiurge, who created the world. And therefore the world and all matter, all creation is evil. And Jesus comes from the good God creator, or the good God, rather, to free us from the evil God. And so Marcion throws out most of the Old Testament, basically all of it. And then he goes, the only person whose testimony he's willing to read in the New Testament is the Gospel of Luke, probably because Luke wasn't Jewish. And he would expunge from the rest of the New Testament that he accepted. He would take out every single mention of the Old Testament. Every time there was an allusion or a reference, he go, that's baloney. That's from the previous unenlightened idiots, And it's funny today because, of course, we still struggle. A lot of people struggle. The first time they ever read an Old Testament text, they go, oh my goodness, God is so mean, I didn't know Jesus would do that. And it's because we don't have the right lens, right? We don't read as the church fathers do. So that to cite a text that you somewhat alluded to earlier, St. Gregory of Nyssa from the 4th century, he dies in 396. He writes a book called The Life of Moses towards the end of his life, where he goes, look, the details about Moses are not given to us just to be like, here's a nice guy. They clearly are telling us about the journey of the spiritual life. And I love when he opens the text, he begins with something that I hadn't really noticed. I'd always glossed over. He goes, why is Moses described as a beautiful baby? And that was a moment for me where I went, hey man, he wrote the book. What do you mean he says he's a beautiful baby? Wow. And Gregory of Nyssa is like, this isn't haphazard, right? This isn't Moses trying to, give himself some sort of...
such a beautiful baby,
Right?
Yeah.
Like, how would he know? But Gregory of Nyssa is like, this is Moses trying to tell us that we can become the authors of our own birth, either into virtue or into sin. Right. He says physical birth is given to us. We have no choice in that. But we can give birth to ourselves. He says, in a sense, we're our own birth givers, our own parents in the spiritual life by choosing virtue or by choosing sin. And he then reads the rest of the life of Moses through this lens of being like, Moses' story is not just told to us for the sake of being a cool story. Because one, they didn't write biographies like this really in the ancient world. But two, the scripture has nothing haphazard or completely extraneous just for like detail's sake. So then the thing that I think of too is he goes, look, when in Egypt, Israel is enslaved and they're making bricks. And Gregory of Nyssa is like, what is brick making other than to be attracted to the things of the earth? Because that's playing in the mud and using straw and mud and water, all those earthly elements. He says that is an example of the individual who's obsessed with the earthly life, who's obsessed with the material, the physical, the tangible, lust, greed, envy, so on and so forth. And he says, what we're being freed from is the tyranny of Pharaoh, who is the devil, right? And so, I mean, it's funny always to say this as Copts, right? But if you said Egypt to somebody from any time contemporaneous with the Lord, you immediately think slavery, death, sin, the devil, right? Because that's what the land of Egypt was, which is why the Lord's descent into that place is actually really important. We celebrate as a feast day, but that's a different matter. We tend to just do it. I think it's like a nice day to celebrate, but and we're coming up to it soon, thank God. But what Gregory of Nyssa says is he's like, look, when we leave Egypt, that's when we depart from the land of sin and slavery and being stuck to brick making, those habits, those addictions that we have that we're controlled by, right? There's interestingly multiple studies on the medical side, right, of addicts. And what they find is that the more an addict uses a thing, the more they rate their need to use the thing, but the less they rate their pleasure obtained from taking the thing. That's basically the definition of addiction. Right. And many of us have experienced this, right? There's a thing that we're hooked to. There's a thing we're addicted to. There's a thing that has enthralled us and that we think, you know what, I am better than that. I can get away from it. Then something bad happens or we have a rough day or somebody says something mean to us at school or at the office or whatever, depending on our life situation.
And go right back to it.
And then we go right back to it, like a master, right? Like somebody holding a whip going, you're coming home. And Gregory of Nyssa is like, that departure from Egypt is all of us. And we go through the Red Sea, having departed the land of sin and slavery and death. And that's drowned, right, in the Red Sea. Clearly a figure of baptism, but also a figure of our repentance. It does both things. And then to live baptismally for us after that is to die to those things of the world, to sin, to slavery, to addiction, and to live to God. Right. And so you read all of this in the life of Moses, and then those people who we were talking about earlier, who regularly went to Tazbihah, are like, wait. That's why we start Tazbihah with the first hosts, where we read about Pharaoh and his hosts and his army being drowned in the Red Sea. I'm like, exactly. Yeah. Because it's that journey that we have that ends, right, with the fourth host, which is everything. Let everything that has breath praise the name of the Lord. That's the climax, right? That's the journey of the spiritual life that we're experiencing in miniature when we do Tazbihah, when we have every day, when we have every week, when we have every church liturgical calendar. And so when you come to something like that, you're like, wow, this scripture stuff really matters, Right. And you suddenly go, the life of Moses is so much different than I thought it was. I didn't realize that I was missing all of these elements in the book of Exodus that were actually educating me about what my life today looks like. And I think it's in that sense that, to come back to the original question you asked many minutes ago now, it's in that sense that together we have come to learn in this meeting, or with people who I know also read the Church Fathers, and we talk and things like that, where we go, yeah, to obtain a mindset, to enter into a mystery is so much different than to say, well, where does it say what repentance looks like? You know, apparently it looks like crossing the Red Sea, but you could never use that as just a, here's the fact kind of argument, right? You'd have to have all of this context go, wow, that's the image. And that's where I think reading the Church Fathers becomes an exercise in changing who you are, rather than learning a few facts. And when people come to that, I think people have their own motivation to be like, yeah, this stuff is real, I want to keep with it. And I think that's the beauty of doing it.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. For questions, comments, feedback, or if you'd like to make a suggestion on a topic for a future episode, please feel free to reach out to the email in the bio. And don't forget to subscribe to get a notification when new episodes drop. God bless you and have a great day.